Hello, my name is Elior. Welcome to tonight's quiet journey. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let your eyes soften, your hands rest, and your thoughts slow down. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe, click the like button, and ring the little bell. It helps this peaceful space reach others who need it too. Now, let's begin. Gently. Tonight's story is not about one religion. It's about the roots beneath them all. In this lecture, we'll explore how the first beliefs were born, long before temples, before written prayers, before organized religions. We'll walk through the early sense of the sacred in nature, the birth of ritual and myth, and the rise of gods, symbols, and sacred spaces. We'll see how humans created meaning through stories, rules, and shared ceremonies. How religion became not just a belief, but a way to belong, to grieve, to hope, and to live. This isn't a history of one tradition, but a gentle journey across cultures and time to understand why, in every corner of the world, humans have always sought the sacred. We are the only creatures who look at the stars and ask, why? Why are we here? Where did we come from? Is someone or something listening? Since the very beginning, humans have reached for something greater, something beyond food and fire, beyond tools and shelter, a presence, a mystery, a shape behind the chaos. Long before there were temples, before sacred books, before names like Zeus or Shiva or God, there was a feeling, a deep, quiet sense that we are not alone, that life means something more than survival. We felt it in storms and stillness, in the cry of a newborn, in the silence after death. We looked at the moon and the mountains and wondered if they were watching us back. We gave the wind a voice, the river a mood, the fire a spirit. This wasn't weakness, it was awareness. Our minds are built for stories. Our hearts are wired for belonging. And religion, in its earliest forms, was both. It gave structure to awe. It made fear bearable. It gave names to the nameless and hope to the helpless. Religion was never just about gods. It was about connection to the earth, to each other, to something we couldn't see, but felt deeply. We won't rush. This is not a debate. It is a soft unfolding of how we've sought the sacred for tens of thousands of years. So lay back. Let your thoughts settle like dust in quiet sunlight. Let the centuries pass like pages in a story. And let us begin together where all religions began, with a question and a feeling. before temples, before gods had names, before even the idea of religion, there was something older, something born from the earth itself, a sense that everything around us was alive. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, humans walked through forests and deserts, slept beneath stars, drank from rivers, and looked around with a kind of listening. To early humans, the world was not silent. The wind whispered, the fire danced, the mountain watched, the tree remembered. This way of seeing the world, where every stone, animal, and river held a spirit, is called animism. It is one of the most ancient ways humans made sense of life. Imagine you are a child living 40,000 years ago. You see a fox slip into the trees. You wonder, what does it know? You see lightning crack the sky. You wonder, who is speaking? There was no clear line between the natural and the spiritual. A storm wasn't just weather. It was a mood, a sign, a presence. Early animistic cultures believed that everything had a spirit, a kind of invisible soul. The river had moods. The stone had memories. The forest could be angry or kind. Some spirits were helpful. Others were dangerous. To live well meant to live in relationship with the world around you, not as its master, but as its guest. People made offerings to trees, sang to animals they hunted, left gifts in caves, and whispered thanks to the moon. This was not superstition. It was attention, a way of being fully present, of seeing life everywhere. Even today, many indigenous cultures carry animist beliefs, honoring sacred mountains, ancestor spirits, or the soul of the wind, not as fantasy, but as a truth felt in the bones. Before we built gods in temples, we saw them in rain, in fire, in stone. Before we prayed with words, we prayed with silence, with movement, with breath. Religion did not begin with books. It began with a gaze, with reverence, with the quiet knowledge that the world around us was not just useful, but holy. If everything around us had a spirit, then every action mattered. And slowly, a new kind of language began to form, not spoken in words, but in gestures, rhythms, and rituals. Long before writing, before chants had lyrics or prayers had names, humans moved their bodies to express meaning. A circle of dancers around a fire, hands raised to the sky before a hunt, a carved mark left near a river where someone had been buried. Rituals were the first form of religion. They weren't just habits. They were acts of memory, tools of transformation, and bridges between the visible and the invisible. Imagine a group of people 30,000 years ago gathered at the edge of the forest. They light a fire. They begin to hum. Slowly, softly, the rhythm builds. They stomp the earth in unison, not to entertain, but to remember, to call upon something older than language, to connect. Ritual is repetition with meaning. When we do the same act over and over with intention, it becomes something sacred. There were rituals for birth, for first hunts, for coming of age, for rain, for healing, for saying goodbye to the dead. And there were rituals tied to the seasons, to the return of the sun after long winters, to the arrival of the rains when the crops needed them most. These seasonal rituals weren't about controlling time. They were about honoring cycles, death and rebirth, growth and letting go. The wheel of life turning. Even today, we light candles on birthdays. We gather in circles for weddings. We mark moments with movement. The ritual lives on, quietly. And when rituals are passed down, through memory, through rhythm, through repetition, they become something deeper. Collective memory. They carry the wisdom of generations through time. Ritual is the body's way of remembering what the soul already knows. Before we had sacred texts, we had sacred gestures. Before belief lived in words, it lived in movement, in breath, in rhythm. Ritual gave rhythm to belief. But something was still missing, a way to hold the sacred, to carry it with us, to see it, even when we were alone. Long before temples or scriptures, humans found ways to make the invisible visible. A carved stone, a painted handprint, a bone shaped into something more than just a tool. These were symbols, not decorations, but vessels of meaning. Some were simple, a spiral etched into a cave wall. Some were personal, a necklace worn for protection. Others were shared by whole tribes, totems passed from one generation to the next. Tens of thousands of years ago, people in what is now Europe and Africa created small carved figures, goddesses of fertility, faces without eyes, curves shaped like water and earth. These weren't just art, they were reminders of birth, of mystery, of power too large to name. To carry a symbol was to carry a connection, to touch something divine in wood, in stone, in clay. totems were not gods themselves, but paths to them, bridges between this world and the next. A symbol could protect. It could explain. It could hold the memory of an ancestor, a dream, a promise. In every ancient culture, from the painted walls of Lascaux to the sacred masks of the Amazon, symbols were central to belief. They told stories without needing words, and they still do. Even now, we wear pendants around our necks, place candles in windows, draw rings around fingers. These are not empty gestures. They are the echoes of something very old. Because sometimes faith needs form, and belief needs a body. When we create sacred objects, we are not just shaping materials. We are shaping meaning. Symbols gave belief a body. But soon, there were those who could go further, who could speak with the spirits directly. Not everyone could do this, but some were called. Long before priests, long before sacred texts and temples, there were shamans. They were not rulers, not warriors, not chosen by blood, but by dreams, by illness, by a calling no one else could hear. The shaman was the first spiritual guide, a bridge between the seen and unseen, between the living and the dead, between the tribe and the great unknown. Tens of thousands of years ago, early humans began to turn to certain individuals during times of sickness, fear, or mystery. These were the ones who heard voices in the fire, who danced until the world bent, who spoke in riddles and returned with answers. Shamans entered altered states, sometimes through breath, sometimes through rhythm, sometimes through sacred plants. They would fall into trance, leaving their body behind to journey into spirit realms. They brought back visions, warnings, names of ancestors, guidance for hunts, or healing for the sick. To the tribe, they were not gods, but travelers between worlds, not always easy to understand, often feared, but always needed. They carried songs that no one else could sing. They painted caves with symbols seen only in dream. In some cultures, they wore masks, feathers, or animal bones, blending human and spirit, becoming the forest, becoming the sky. We know from archaeological sites over 30,000 years old that certain graves held individuals buried with strange tools, ornaments, and objects linked to trance and vision. These may have been early shamans, honored not for their strength, but for their sight. And today, in many indigenous traditions, shamans still walk that same path, still guided by drumbeat, by dream, by silence. They remind us that not all knowledge is logical, that some wisdom must be felt, not taught, In a world where everything was alive, shamans were the ones who could speak its language. The shaman brought back visions. But how do you pass on a vision? How do you carry a dream through time? With a story, with a myth. Stories were not born to entertain. They were born to explain, to anchor us in a swirling world of thunder, birth, hunger, and death. Thousands of years before writing, people gathered around fires and told each other how the world began, not as fact, but as meaning. These were the first myths, sacred stories that told not only what happened, but why it matters. Creation myths emerged everywhere. In one, the world was woven from the breath of a giant. In another, it hatched from a cosmic egg. In another still, it was formed from the bones of a slain monster. These myths may sound fantastical to us now, but to those who spoke them, they were truth. A kind of truth that lives in symbol and rhythm, not in dates and measurements. Through myth, the sky was not just a sky, but a ceiling painted by gods. The ocean, not just water, but the tears of an ancient spirit. The stars, the eyes of ancestors. Myths taught children who they were, where they came from, why the sun rises, why the wolf howls, why people die. They answered the deepest human questions with shape, voice, and emotion. They weren't only told, they were sung, danced, painted on cave walls. They were carried in masks, in tattoos, in symbols passed from one hand to another. Every culture had them. And though the details differed, the core was always the same. We come from something. We are part of something. And we are not alone. Even today, the myths of ancient peoples echo in the stories we tell, in heroes who journey and fall and rise, in floods, fires, and sacred mountains, in the quiet belief that our lives mean more than just survival. Myth is how we remembered what couldn't be written yet. It was our first theology, our first science, our first mirror, because to tell a story is to create a world, and the first gods were born inside those stories. Myths gave shape to mystery, but soon the shapes gained names. The forces of wind, sun, and death. They became someone, not just something. They became gods. In the earliest times, people felt the world was full of spirits. The wind, the river, the fire, all were alive. But over time, these spirits began to change. They became more distinct, more personal. They were given voices and names. They became gods. This shift from the spirit of the storm to the god of the storm was a turning point in belief. Around 5,000 years ago, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus, people began to shape the divine. They carved features into stone, built altars and temples, and offered not just worship, but relationship. The sun was no longer just light. It was Ra, sailing across the sky in a golden boat. The sky became Nut, a goddess arching above the earth. Storms had a name, Enlil. Love became Inanna. Even war and wisdom had faces and stories. These gods lived lives. They loved and fought. They punished and protected. They cried. They remembered. And they watched over the world. This is what we call anthropomorphism, giving human traits to the divine. And it made the universe feel closer. You could speak to the gods because they listened. You could make offerings because they felt hunger. You could hope because they could understand. Pantheons appeared, groups of gods with roles, emotions, and relationships. Across cultures, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, the divine became a mirror of human life. People no longer worshipped a force. They worshipped a face, a name, a story. It helped structure society. Each city, profession, or season had its own protector. But more than that, it brought comfort. In a dangerous world, there was someone greater who might just care. And so, belief moved from something unseen everywhere to something seen somewhere. From mystery to closeness, the gods came near. As soon as humans began naming gods, they began building for them. Not just shelters, not just stone, but something sacred. A place where the human world and the divine world could touch. Some of the earliest sacred structures were not cities or palaces, but temples. Over 11,000 years ago, at a site called Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, humans carved massive stone pillars into circular sanctuaries. There were no signs of homes nearby, only ritual. They had no metal tools, no wheels, no writing, but they built for the gods. Later, in ancient Mesopotamia, people raised ziggurats, stepped towers made of clay and sun. They believed the gods lived at the top. Each level brought you closer to the sky. To climb was to rise into meaning. In ancient Egypt, temples aligned with stars. Columns were shaped like papyrus and lotus, linking heaven, earth, and water. To enter the sanctuary was to enter eternity. In India, Temples were seen as the body of the cosmos. Each curve, dome, and carving was part of a sacred story. Geometry as devotion. In Greece and Rome, temples honored gods with perfect form, marble, light, balance. The home of the divine reflected the ideal human world. Temples were more than places. They were presence. They told people, "Here, you are seen. Here, something greater listens." They also defined space. The sacred was no longer everywhere. It was somewhere. You had to journey, to prepare, to cross a threshold from the ordinary into the holy. Some came to pray. Some came to give thanks. Some came just to feel, to be still, to look up. Even today, when you step into a quiet cathedral, a silent shrine, a hidden chapel in the forest, you feel it. The stillness, the weight of meaning, the echo of ancient hands who built not just walls, but wonder. Because to build for the divine is to make space for the sacred in this very world. Temples rose, gods were named, and rituals grew. But with many people came many choices, and with choices came questions. What is right? What is wrong? And who decides? Religion did not only explain the stars or give comfort in death, it also gave something more immediate: rules, a way to live, a way to be good. From the very beginning, humans struggled with conflict. We hurt, we lied, we stole. But as societies grew, there had to be a better way. And so, belief began to shape behavior. The earliest moral systems were not enforced by kings, but by the gods. You followed the rules not because someone was watching, but because something greater was. Something invisible, eternal, and just. In Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago, the Code of Hammurabi was carved in stone, laws given divine backing. To disobey was to sin not only against people, but against the divine order. In ancient Egypt, the concept of ma'at, truth, justice, balance, was sacred. At death, your heart was weighed against a feather. If it was heavy with sin, you could not pass on. In India, karma and dharma became spiritual laws. Your actions shaped your next life. Your role had purpose. Morality was a cosmic rhythm. In Judaism, the 10 Commandments gave structure to everyday life. Honor your parents. Do not kill. Do not bear false witness. Simple, clear, sacred. These codes became the bones of civilization. They taught people how to live together, not only what was forbidden, but what was expected. Kindness, justice, mercy. And so religion became a form of social glue. It gave people a reason to do good even when no one was looking. It created a sense of conscience, that small inner voice that whispers before we act. Heaven and hell, sin and virtue, reward and punishment. These were not just beliefs. They were tools to guide behavior, to shape communities, to hold chaos back. And even today, in a world of laws and courts, much of our deepest sense of right and wrong still echoes these ancient codes. Religion gave us gods, but it also gave us guidelines, not to limit us, but to teach us how to live with one another. Rules were taught, stories were shared, myths and morals flowed from one voice to another. But voices fade. What happens when the storyteller is gone? How do you hold on to something invisible? You write it down. Long before books, there was memory. People passed beliefs from mouth to mouth, like flame passed from torch to torch. The old woman would sing the creation of the world. The young boy would memorize the laws of the land. A hunter would whisper the prayers of his ancestors before entering the forest. These were oral traditions, spoken teachings that were sacred because they were shared. To speak was to believe. To listen was to inherit. In some cultures, entire histories were remembered word for word, not for 1 year, but for centuries. But memory is fragile. Voices disappear. And so, around 5,000 years ago, humans began to write. At first, it was clay and symbol, markings to track grain, trade, time. But then came something more, the first efforts to record the sacred. The ancient Vedas of India, some of the oldest religious texts, were sung for centuries before being written in Sanskrit. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh carried the voice of the divine through cuneiform etched into tablets. In Judaism, the Torah was not just law, it was covenant, a written relationship between God and people. In Christianity, the Gospels became the breath of Christ captured on parchment. In Islam, the Quran is considered not just inspired, but the literal Word of God transmitted in perfect Arabic, recited and preserved with reverence. In every case, to write was to make eternal. These texts were not just documents, they were portals to truth, to identity, to the divine. Scriptures gave faith a foundation. They brought order to belief, and they united people across time and place. To read a sacred text was to enter a conversation with every soul who had ever read it. And yet, even now, the oral never fully disappeared. The chants of monks, the whispered prayers of elders, the bedtime stories told with reverence, these are also sacred. Whether sung, spoken, or inscribed, the wisdom lives on because we share it. And so, faith became both voice and ink, both living and lasting. A sacred text is not just a book. It is a mirror, a memory, a map for the soul. Some heard the gods in thunder, others found them in stars, but a few said they heard words, not from within, but from beyond. And what they heard changed the world. At certain moments in history, a single person stepped forward and said, "I have seen, I have heard, I have been shown." These were not kings, not warriors, not builders, but prophets. They came not with armies, but with messages. In ancient cultures, prophets were often outsiders, wanderers, dreamers, people who listened too deeply or saw what others refused to see. They did not speak for themselves. They claimed to speak for something greater, a God, a truth, a presence that had no voice until it chose them. Some called for change. Others warned of consequences. Many offered hope. But all of them disturbed the silence. In ancient Israel, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel called people to justice, mercy, and remembrance of God. They spoke of exile and return, of covenant and compassion. In the 6th century BCE, Zoroaster in Persia preached of good and evil, of moral choice, of a final judgment, and introduced the idea of a singular divine will. In India, around the same time, Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, left his palace to seek an end to suffering. He became not a prophet of gods, but of awakening, a teacher of inner truth. In the 1st century, Jesus of Nazareth traveled the hills of Judea, speaking of love, humility, forgiveness. He spoke not only as a teacher, but as a voice of divine presence among people. In the 7th century, Muhammad of Mecca said the angel Gabriel came to him with words, the Quran, which he recited verse by verse as a message for all humankind. Prophets challenged kings. They stood alone in crowds. They spoke of what was unseen as if it were more real than anything. And whether or not people believed them, they listened. Because a prophet is not only a messenger, they are also a mirror, showing society what it has become and what it might still be. They remind us that the sacred is not locked in the heavens. It can arrive in human voice, in quiet courage, in a single sentence that stirs the soul. And through them, religion becomes not only ritual, but revelation, not only tradition, but transformation. Prophets spoke of the divine, texts preserved its voice, but one question never stopped echoing. What happens when we die? Where does the breath go? The warmth, the I that used to be. Since the beginning, death has been both a fact and a mystery. People watched loved ones close their eyes and never open them again. And in that stillness grew the first questions of faith. Across nearly every culture, burial was never just disposal. It was ritual, careful, symbolic, sacred. In caves more than 40,000 years ago, humans buried their dead with red ochre, tools, beads, and food. Not for memory, but for the journey ahead. They believed the soul would go somewhere, and so they prepared it. In ancient Egypt, bodies were preserved for eternity, organs placed in sacred jars, books of the dead painted or written to guide the soul. The afterlife was seen as another Egypt, but perfected. In Hinduism, the soul is eternal. It passes from one body to another in a cycle called samsara. Your next life depends on your karma, your actions, your choices. In Buddhism, too, rebirth continues until enlightenment is reached, until craving ends and the soul finds stillness. In Christianity, death is not the end, but the beginning of eternal life. A soul is judged, and if found worthy, welcomed into heaven, a place of peace, union, light. In Islam, after death comes barzakh, an in-between state before the final resurrection and judgment. Here, too, faith, intention, and action shape what comes next. Some traditions believe in ancestral spirits watching over the living. Others speak of reunions beyond the grave. And some of simply returning to the earth as part of a greater cycle. But all of them, from the oldest tribes to the most global faiths, share one thing. They cannot imagine that love, memory, or being could vanish into nothing. The soul must go somewhere, even if that somewhere is only a whisper in the wind, a glimmer in the stars, or the warmth in the heart of those who remember. And so, religion gave us stories not only for living, but for letting go, to grieve with hope, to fear less, to imagine more. And maybe that's why, across time, across lands, people looked at the night sky and whispered to the ones who had gone before, "Are you there?" Over time, small beliefs became shared truths, and sacred whispers turned into global echoes. People no longer just worshipped by the river or in the forest. They gathered in temples, in cities, in nations. and faith began to shape entire worlds. As human societies grew, so did their questions. Why are we here? What is good? What happens after we die? The search for answers became more structured, more layered, and more widely shared. In ancient India, around 1500 years before our era, the earliest spiritual texts, the Vedas, were composed. They laid the foundation for what would become Hinduism, a religion of cycles, life, death, and rebirth. A faith with many gods and many paths, but one deeper unity beneath them all. Around the same time, in the land of Canaan, a group of people began to worship one God. This was the beginning of Judaism, a faith built on covenant, law, memory, and survival. The idea of a single, invisible, moral God would go on to shape the beliefs of billions. Several centuries later, in the 6th century before our era, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama left his palace in search of truth beyond suffering. He became the Buddha, the awakened one. Buddhism focused not on gods, but on the mind. It taught about suffering, desire, compassion, and peace. In the 1st century, in Roman Judea, a Jewish teacher named Jesus of Nazareth preached love, forgiveness, and humility. He was crucified, and his followers believed he rose again. They became the first Christians. Their message spread through the Roman Empire and beyond. In the 7th century, in the deserts of Arabia, a man named Muhammad began receiving revelations that would become the Quran. He called people to worship one God, Allah, with compassion, justice, and full devotion to the divine will. This was the birth of Islam, which would, within a few centuries, stretch from Spain to India. Each of these religions brought sacred texts, spiritual teachers, and rituals. They offered moral direction and comfort in times of suffering. But religion also became culture. It shaped how people dressed, ate, married, and mourned. It shaped languages, music, and law. Empires rose in its name. And though their beliefs are different, all of these faiths grew from the same human soil. They asked the same deep questions. What is the meaning of life? What is good? How should we live together? Religion became more than personal. It became political. It became social. It became history. And still, at the center of every faith, there is a human heart, seeking peace, seeking purpose, seeking something greater. As faith spread, so did its influence. It was no longer only found in forests or caves, but in palaces, capitals, and crowns. Religion began to sit beside power, and sometimes it became power. From the earliest civilizations, the sacred and the political were rarely far apart. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, kings were not just rulers. They were chosen by the gods, or seen as gods themselves. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were believed to be divine in flesh, living bridges between the earth and the sky. In Babylon, kings built temples to honor gods, but also to remind people who held the favor of the heavens. In India, the idea of dharma, cosmic law, was deeply tied to social order. Kings ruled not just with armies, but with religious legitimacy. And across time, priests and rulers often needed each other. Priests gave kings divine authority. Kings gave priests land, protection, and power. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church crowned emperors. Popes held more sway than kings. Cathedrals rose higher than palaces. In the Islamic world, caliphs were both political and spiritual leaders. Law and faith were one, and the Quran was both scripture and constitution. Religion could unite. Shared belief brought together tribes, cities, empires. Pilgrimage routes became roads of peace. Common rituals became national identity. But religion could also divide. The Crusades, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, were wars fought in the name of faith. So were countless others. One group's sacred truth became another's heresy. The Reformation in the 16th century split Europe along religious lines. Protestants and Catholics, each claiming purity, each shaping nations. Empires used religion as a banner, to conquer, to convert, to control. But among all this, there were also voices of conscience. Saints, philosophers, poets, people who reminded the powerful that faith was not about domination, but humility, compassion, and truth. And even today, in the modern world, the bond between faith and power remains. Some governments embrace religion. Others fear it, but none can fully ignore it, because belief moves people, and people shape history. Faith has power, but also pressure, and with time, even the strongest walls begin to show small cracks, not of destruction, but of curiosity. No belief system exists without questions, and no religion, however ancient or wide, has gone untouched by doubt. Even in the earliest traditions, people wondered, why do the gods allow suffering? What if another tribe's god is stronger? What happens when the priests contradict each other? These were not just whispers. They became movements. In Judaism, questioning is sacred. The Talmud itself is a collection of debates. rabbis across centuries discussing law, morality, and meaning. Doubt was never rejection. It was engagement. In Buddhism, the Buddha himself invited followers to test his teachings. He said, "Do not believe something just because I said it. Experience it for yourself." But in many systems, doubt became heresy, a threat to order, a challenge to power. In the 4th century, as Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion, any divergence from church doctrine was met with punishment. Councils gathered to decide, what is true faith, and what must be silenced? Those labeled heretics were often thinkers, mystics, or visionaries. People like Giordano Bruno, who imagined an infinite universe and was burned for it in 1600. Or Martin Luther, who in 1517 nailed 95 theses to a church door, protesting corruption and igniting the Reformation. This act split Christianity and created Protestant churches across Europe. In Islam, too, reform movements rose, from Sufis who sought God through poetry and dance, to philosophers like Averroes and Al-Farabi, who bridged Greek thought with Quranic faith. Heresy was often just a new path, one that didn't yet have a name, and change came from within. Women, once silent in temples and mosques, began to speak. Marginalized voices found space, and new religions, like the Baha'i faith or Sikhism, emerged to blend ideas, to unify instead of divide. In our time, faith continues to evolve. People leave, return, reimagine. Some pray to the same God in new languages. Some find holiness in science, or silence, or nature. And that's perhaps the quiet truth. Faith is not a stone. It is a river. It bends, it flows, and still it seeks the sea. Belief never disappears. It may change its name. It may lose its temples. But the longing remains. Even today, in a world of logic and speed, faith quietly whispers through the noise. We live in an age of information. Satellites, algorithms, instant knowledge. The mysteries of the past often feel replaced by data. Yet despite this, the questions that shaped religion have never gone away. Who am I? Why do I suffer? What connects me to the universe? In the 20th century, many believed religion would fade. As education rose, as science explained more, as society became more global, people predicted a secular world. And indeed, for many, religion lost its central place. Church attendance declined. Rituals became tradition, not truth. And in some countries, Entire generations grew up without a single prayer. But something unexpected happened. People began to search again, not always for religion, but for meaning. They turned to meditation, to mindfulness, to philosophy, to the quiet wisdom of nature. Some found the divine in the stars, others in silence, in breath, in art, in love. The word spirituality replaced religion for many, a softer, more personal path. In the 21st century, we see faith fragment and bloom. There are still billions who pray, Muslims bowing toward Mecca, Christians lighting candles, Buddhists chanting in temples. But there are also millions who find holiness in forest walks, in poetry, in the kindness of strangers. Science and faith no longer stand as enemies. Many now see them as complementary, two ways of exploring the same mystery, one through reason, the other through reverence. And in the heart of this modern world is a quiet return, a soft turning inward. We light candles not because we must, but because we want to feel stillness. We whisper prayers not for salvation, but for connection. And maybe this is the future of faith, not loud, not rigid, but deeply human. A breath, a pause, a presence. That reminds us we are part of something larger and more luminous than we can ever fully explain. And now, as the world quiets around you, we return, not to temples or myths, but to something smaller, something closer, something within. If we look across thousands of years, from painted caves to golden cathedrals, from whispered prayers to silent meditation, what do we truly find? Not just gods with names, not only rituals or sacred rules, but something deeper, a quiet and shared longing to make sense of the world and of ourselves. In every culture, in every age, people looked up to the sky and asked the same gentle questions. Where did we come from? What happens after death? What holds us when we break? Some found answers in sacred texts, others in fire, in chants, in dreams. Some heard God in thunder, some saw spirit in a tree. And even though beliefs may differ, some worship many, some worship one, and some worship none. The thread between them is the same, a search for meaning, for belonging, for peace. Maybe that is what makes faith powerful, not the certainty, but the yearning, not the answers, but the stillness that lets us sit with the questions. In today's noisy world, Perhaps faith is something small and steady, a quiet breath, a candle lit in silence, a story passed from voice to voice, a kindness offered without reason, a hand held in the dark. And maybe, in the end, the most sacred place is not on a mountain, not in a book, not beyond the stars, but within you, where memory meets mystery, where silence becomes a song, where wonder never left. So tonight, let your mind rest. Let your spirit wander. There is no need to understand everything. There is beauty in not knowing. May your dreams be soft, your heart unburdened, and your sleep deep and peaceful. Until we meet again in another story, on another night, in another quiet question. Good night, and gentle peace be with you.